Chile webinar. We have the pleasure of having Claudia Macaluso from Richmond Fed. Before we start, let me remind you the format of the webinar. We try to make our webinar as close as possible to a regular seminar, so feel free to make questions during the talk. Please be mindful of the time so other people can ask and Claudia can answer the questions. The presentation is going to be 1 hour and then we have some time for discussion. So Claudia, the floor is yours. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Agustin. Thank you so much to everyone who's joining and who will be seeing this webinar. I am absolutely delighted to be with you. I would have preferred to be in Santiago, but hey, life is complicated, but I hope to be able to meet you all in person at some point. So this is Job Dynamics with Staff Labor. It's joint work with Andrea Atencio, who is one of my former students and now at the IMF, and with Chenya, who's a colleague at Richmond. And because we work in the Federal Reserve System, I have to tell you that these are not the views of the Fed, no parts of the Fed whatsoever. They're also not the view of the Census Bureau. This work is going to be using census administrative data. And so the Census Bureau's Disclosure Review Board and disclosure avoidance officers have reviewed this information product for any unauthorized disclosure of confidential information. And hopefully that is not the most interesting part of my talk, but I had to tell you all of that. So what is this paper about? This paper is essentially about a new technology to source labor that is very well spread. It's very common in many countries, and I'm sure Chile is one of them. But it's also not.
I think we only can see your first slide. Did you move the slide?
I did not move the slides yet.
Oh, okay, perfect.
I'm just talking.
I was just
so
sure.
it's going to come in a second.
Sorry,
okay.
Claudia.
No, I know. No, please. I don't know if you can see my face. That's the problem. Are you just staring at the slide? Presumably. Okay. So what was I telling you? I was telling you that this technology is very common in the real world. It's not so common in our models, in our economics. So I wanted to sort of think, I want to think about that. What is this technology? This technology I'm going to refer to as staffing. Staffing is an intermediated technology to source labor, which means that instead of going to the labor market directly, a firm can source labor by contracting with another firm, a firm that provides, in fact, human resource services. This type of intermediation is very common and very well studied in capital markets. Those are banks. They connect the supply and the demand for capital. Intermediated technologies in the labor market are actually quite similar, but they're much less sort of studied. And this is what we're going to do today. This is also important. We find that every year, staffing is equivalent to about 25% of aggregate hires. So if you want, you might think of 1 in 4 hires in the US economy, and in particular in US manufacturing, as coming through staffing. And also, it's been increasing. It's not just sort of larger baseline, it's becoming larger and larger. We showed that the share of revenue that's spent on staff labor by the average manufacturer is in fact increasing by about 85% since 2006, which is the first year of our data. So what do we do in this paper? We do, yes.
Hi, Marco here from the bank. I have the question of, is this a staff labor? Is this for the main occupations of the firm, or is it more like the cleaning or the human resources part?
I'll talk about it in a second just here, but essentially you should be thinking of core occupations. That is going to be a very important distinction, so thank you for the question. But you'll see we're going to be talking about core occupations, so not accessory services, for example. So let me tell you what we do in the paper, and then we'll go into that.
So may I ask you some related question on that? Alejandro Mico here from the University of Chile. This is related with temporary agency workers?
Yes, it is. It's in fact so staffed workers will be temporary workers, will be leased workers. Again, if you give me one slide, I'll tell you all about it. Thank you. So let me tell you what we do in this paper, which is sort of useful. Why do we care about staffing? So we care about staffing for a couple of different reasons, but one is that if you think of movements of workers across establishments as the way that productivity grows, at least that's how I think about it. I have sort of a basic model of productivity growth in the economy, and we want to move resources towards the most productive establishments. These means that the most productive establishments should get bigger. How do they get bigger? They add workers. They add capital, they add workers. If a lot of these movements of workers are happening through the umbrella of staffing rather than regular employment, I will show you that there is a significant mismeasurement. And this is why when you look at the total job reallocation rate, which is precisely this measure of how much are we moving jobs to their most productive location, this needs to be corrected for what we call staffed reallocations. And that correction would account for about 37% of the measured decline in job reallocation that has been documented by others. So not sure how familiar you are with this literature. It's true in many countries that job reallocation, worker reallocation, churn, all sorts of measures of turnover have been trending down over time. We'll show that they haven't just disappeared. They haven't just trended down. They have gone into staffing. Then we'll talk a little bit about why do plants use staffing anyway. This is important, but why do firms do it? And we'll show that one of the main things is the flexibility in adjusting labor. And finally, we'll have something to say, well, we'll see how time goes, but we'll have something to say that suggests that staffing contributes to some other trends as well, the concentration of labor in older and larger establishments, and an increase in average tenure for workers. And because you guys asked, I'm going to move on to this part. And then if you have more questions, please let me know. So the way I'd like to think about staffing is exactly as this intermediated technology. Let's take a client business. In our data, this will be a manufacturing business. So it's a producer of widgets or objects. In fact, one that I talked about I talked with, at the Fed, I don't know if this is true for you guys as well, but at the Fed, we get the privilege of talking to actual firms sometimes. So I talked to a producer of helicopters. So these people make helicopters. This firm is called Agusta. It's actually an Italian firm of all possibilities. And they can do two things, right? They can hire directly. This is my blue people on this side. This is the way we normally measure hires and think of hires. I'm going to refer to it as payroll employment. Why? Because the blue people are on the payroll of the client business. In the US, the piece of paper that gives you the taxes and your compensation is called a W-2. So client business, Agusta, issues a W-2 to the blue worker. The workers are on the payroll. They are officially employees of my client business. They work on the production line, to your question, Marco, before, and they are welders, they are machine setters, they are core business workers. Then my client business can do something else. They can also contract out with a staffing agency, temporary help agency, that's what people were mentioning just a moment ago, or professional employment organizations. These are very specific type of intermediaries that only provide labor. This is also important because they do not provide services. So for example, you may think of the catering companies or the cleaning and safety companies that very often are contracted by firms to provide services, food services, cooking and serving, or safety services, or cleaning and maintenance. This is not what these type of intermediaries do. These offer labor only. In fact, the key distinction is who owns the capital. The workers that are contracted out through the staffing agency, these are my orange people over here, they are going to work alongside the blue worker at the client business, using the client business's capitals and machines, using the location of the client business, using the supervision and the protocols of the client business. This is not true for the services. Like if you have, say, a catering company, they're going to have their own material, they're going to have their own protocols. So this is where the difference comes in. We're going to refer to this core business workers as staffing and the other thing as outsourcing. This is not completely settled in the literature, to be fair. But this is what is going to be in this paper. There are other things as well. Independent contractors, just sort of consultants, and other types of contracting agencies. Some of them, for example, are more for sort of high-end consulting, if you want. These are going to be outside the scope of what I'm going to talk about today. So long story short, Augusta, who's making helicopters, can make helicopters with employment that is on their payroll books or not. They can pay, say, manpower to get welders through manpower. So the key point here, and that's why I'm spending so much time on it, is who issues the W-2, the piece of paper that puts you on payroll for the orange workers? Well, that's the staffing agency, say Manpower, not the client business. So I already start seeing essentially what this paper is about. In the old days, we would call reallocation hires and fires. And so we have job creation, job destruction that goes through registration via payroll. Now, what happens is that the staffing agency, this little sort of over here, sends their workers on assignment to many different businesses. It's one time a helicopter maker, some other time is a car manufacturer, and so on and so forth. But none of these changes, none of these transitions are registered because there are no changes in the W-2. And so there are no changes in payroll. These reallocations do not exist for the data. The whole point of this paper is to measure those and ask if they matter and ask why they happen. And I see that someone, Mario, you have your hand up.
Yes. Hi, Claudia. Also Mario from the bank also. I have a question regarding the client business owning the staffing company. How are you gonna treat those? Like they're consolidated, basically the same big enterprise, but
okay, so
they hire one of their own to hire the labor.
Okay, that's very interesting. So what you're saying is what if essentially the client business decides that the HR department is now their own firm, they excorporated, so to speak, and now they're calling that a different thing, but really is just as some kind of scheme. So I've seen some of that in the context of Mexico, for example, in a paper that Joe Kowalski and others have. And there, that kind of practice has actually been outlawed because it was essentially a way to skirt taxes and other obligations the firm would have. In the US, do you guys hear me? Because I think you all froze.
Oh yeah, perfect.
Okay,
No, perfect.
great. I
Perfect.
just wanted to make sure. So in the US, that doesn't happen. And in addition, you must have this designation. You have to be a temp help agency or a PO. This is like a specific industry classification 5613. Those kind of sort of external, it would take some sort of fixed cost to set up this kind of business. So I am not aware of a lot of firms trying sort of to do these shell company scheme, at least in the US context.
It's not a shell company scheme. What I'm thinking is like,
okay.
For example, you have an airline company that provides the service of those small trucks that move the airplanes around the airport. And that is a different company that can also provide services to another airlines, for example. But they belong to in this case, the client business.
Oh, okay. So you're talking about ownership. I won't have
Yes.
much information on ownership actually. Most of the staffing agencies are actually relatively small. It ends up being a very competitive sector. But I won't have too much to say about who owns what. I mean, for all that I can tell, these are different businesses.
Okay.
There is a contract between them that we exchange money for labor, and that's all that sort of I'll be able to say. I do not know if sort of the staffing agency is owned by the client business, but my sense is the staffing agencies are typically much smaller, and client businesses tend to source from a few different ones as well.
Okay.
Just like, businesses have a credit line with a couple of banks and mortgages with one or two different banks. Maybe there is one that is their preferred, but it's the same way sort of here. You get this labor line of credit, if you want, from firms. And in fact, this is kind of interesting because the way it works is that the the staffing agencies have workers on payrolls, and these workers are available. They mark themselves available, and they can be sort of sent to the client business on a very short notice. And this sort of setup is exactly what makes us think that these workers are not used as a substitute necessarily for all sort of payroll workers, for the blue workers, but they're used especially when the firm goes through times of change, of rapid adjustment. That matters for productivity, but that also tells me that this is not just a change in the way we sort of call HR, which is somewhat related to your question. But I'll tell you more about this in a minute. Okay, so
Thank
let's
you.
to fix ideas. Yes, so I don't see everyone, so please just interrupt.
Yes, Gloria,
Oh, what happened there?
this is Ernesto Pasten from the bank. My internet connection was breaking up at the beginning, so sorry if you said this already. Shall we think about the blue workers as permanent workers hired directly by the firm, and the reddish workers, temporary workers for the client business, but in administrative data, they show up as permanent workers of the staffing company? Is that what is going on?
That would be accurate almost to a point. The only thing that you would want not to think is the permanent. In the United States, most employment is at will, so blue workers can be fired relatively easily from the point of view of the law. If you were looking at places like France, like Spain, like Italy, like Mexico, that would be more accurate. So blue workers can also be temporary. They can have a 2-year contract. The average duration of the orange worker job is about 12 weeks in practice. So it is true that these are shorter, and that makes sense, and you'll see why. But that's almost perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any more questions? Sorry, I don't see anyone, so just interrupt. So what do I want to say? In all of our models, especially if you come from sort of a macro labor or firm sort of dynamics kind of background, you would think of job changes and employer changes as exactly the same thing. In fact, that's how we run our AKM regressions and so on and so forth. We think of job and employers as the same entity. They are not here, because your legal employer, what I'm going to call the employer of record, as Ernesto was sort of mentioning, is the staffing agency, but your job is making helicopters. And so these two things, that's the distinction that's going to sort of put us into trouble, because the data is not set up to measure these two things separately. Why is this like that? Sorry, these are all like, give me just one sec. These are all like, I thought I had a different order. That's all right. I can explain it to you in whatever order. So essentially the measurement problem, there's a measurement problem. We are missing some reallocations. We are missing some of these movements across plans. The normal way we measure this is defined as gross job reallocation. This is a measure that sort of dates back to the 90s. It's essentially the sum of plant level job gains and job losses that occur between two periods, T-1 and T. This is a measure that sort of is meant to capture how firms grow or shrink and how much turnover is in there. So this is sort of job reallocation at T is going to be the sum over all establishment J of the net changes in employment between these two periods. Net changes can be positive. Some plants grow, that's J plus. And this is job creation. These are the plants that expanded. And then we're going to sum to that the plants that in fact shrank, which is a set J minus, and this is job destruction. All we are arguing is that if you want to do this kind of computation and you're interested in how many jobs have been added, how many jobs have been destroyed, you should consider all jobs, whether they are filled by a staffed workers or they're filled with a payroll workers, because that is labor that gets added or shed. And so we want to think of total labor. Total labor at T is the sum of payroll workers, the blue people, and staffing workers, the orange people. And you want to sort of do these to add both of them to these calculations. I see one hand up. You're just lucky because you happen to be in my panel, but please just interrupt because I don't see everyone's. I only see 4 people. So
thank you,
go
Claudia.
ahead, Luis, please.
Luis from the bank also. We are not saying anything about the skills, isn't it? I mean, they can move from each sector. I mean, there's no barrier of skills, anything in this setup.
Absolutely, that's a great question. So these again, I think what you're pointing out is that there is a sense in which I'm sweeping under the rug substitutability. Are these really the same workers? Is it really just, you take an orange one, you make it blue, and that's the only thing that changes their contract? The answer is yes and no. On the one hand, staffed workers are essentially indistinguishable from payroll workers. When you go on the factory floor and they're making helicopters, no one knows who's staffed and who is payroll, and then they will disappear, where they fired, where they sort of like, did they quit or whatever. So there's that aspect. This is why, by the way, we're thinking of staffing and not the outsourcing of services, because there the skill gradient is much larger. Say, for example, with cleaning services versus welders or assemblers. However, you're right that what I'm doing here by telling you you can just sum the 2 types of labor is essentially telling you these are perfectly substitutable. Later in the paper, we'll refine that. So you can think of this as sort of like an upper bound. What we're doing right now in the official data is we never put in the staffing. So we have the opposite assumption, which is they are not substitutable at all. They should not be counted at all in reallocation. So now you can see that sort of what we have right now is sort of like a lower bound on the role of staffing. What I'll present is an upper bound on the role of staffing up to a certain extent. And then I'll tell you a little bit how I'm trying to get in the middle to a more quantitative answer.
Wonderful, thank you.
So then, exactly, the traditional measure only takes the payroll. So it's missing entirely these other bit. This whole paper is about adding the staffing. This is complicated because you got to go out and measure it, and part of these issues, the suitabilities are there. But there's also the fact that this is never counted in the data, so we have to come up with a creative way to get a number for these jobs. And that's the first part of the paper. The second part of the paper asks, okay, you added these things. What does it mean from an economic point of view? Should we add them with a sort of a one substitutability parameter, 1-for-1? How should we think about it? How do firms think about it? That's the second part of the paper, is asking, why do firms in fact use this labor? Why don't they use it for all of their labor? Just trying to understand the economics of it. There's a large literature.
Sorry, Claudia.
Claudia, yes,
may
go
I
ahead.
ask you one quick question?
Of course.
The GR is aggregate?
Yes, this is the job reallocation. And this is the aggregate job reallocation rate. This is plants. Plants.
So
yes.
the staffing companies, do they have plants? They are considered plants?
Yes.
So is there double counting at the in your proposed correction for GR?
There would be if I were able to do all of these in the aggregate economy. This is going to be in manufacturing, and the staffing companies are in labor services. Okay. So they are in different sector. That's actually a great question, because in many countries there's concern about the shrinking of manufacturing. People have shown, and in fact it's this paper here, the Assmann and Polivka, they have shown that actually if you take into account staffing, manufacturing hasn't diminished as much. In fact, it has even grown in the last few years. Just labor has shifted from payroll to staffing. And in case you are curious, there's some work in France, these last few papers. There's actually some work on outsourcing in Argentina, from what I understand. My sense is that we are sort of the first to put down sort of administrative data on this, which has added value. And we also mostly talk about the client business. Most of the other papers are focused on the effects on workers. We'll touch a little bit on that because I'm going to use that literature at some point, but we also want to understand why firms use it. Is this a good substitution for the old reallocation in terms of productivity growth? And of course, the paper sort of speaks to some of these aggregate trends that most macroeconomists sort of talk about. We are particularly focused on labor market dynamism, these measures of vitality, if you want, of the labor markets, the ability of the labor markets to bring the right workers to the right jobs. Okay, so I touched on most of this, but this is the plan I had for today. Some of this will go very fast because we already talked about it. So I want to reiterate what's the root of mismeasurement, the fundamental problem. One thing I'm interested in is, for example, if this is true in any administrative source, perhaps. So I know that, for example, in other countries, there has been some changes to try to alleviate this mismeasurement. These type of arrangements, alternative work arrangements, become more common. Then I'm going to tell you how we use the data we have, not the ones we wish we had, to remedy to this problem. And then I'll show you some facts about staffing. And finally, I'll go into why firms use staffing, what's the economics behind it. This is probably more for the discussion. So we also use some worker level data, and hopefully I got a few minutes to talk about what comes next. Okay, so as you probably already have pretty clear in your mind, the main problem is that there are some reallocations, some movements of jobs across establishments that are omitted because they go through these special contracts, which is not a W-2 employment contract, it's the staffing contract. So this is perhaps also going a little bit to your question of double counting, Ernesto. So what am I thinking here? I'm thinking that we have the agency, which is in the service sector. It's here on the left, it's the black one. And then there are two businesses, green and gray. So green and gray are in manufacturing. So this is where I'm going to be computing the job reallocation rate potentially. This is the data I have. While I do know things about also job creation in the staffing agency sectors from the LBD. So let's say that the agency in both periods has 4 workers. So their change is none. This is true both in measurement and economics. Nothing is happening to the agency. The green business, on the other hand, creates 2 jobs. See, it goes from 2 to 4. And this is sort of true for both places. Now, the gray business goes from 2 to 0. And these 2 are measured via staffing. So what am I doing here? So all I want to say, sorry, I may be getting confused with the numbers. I thought this would be clarifying. All I wanted to say here is that if the number, if the jobs that are shed are just severing a contract with the staffing agency, this is not going to be counted. But in the economics, it should be. So manufacturing is creating and destroying jobs, but because they are filled with staff workers, they don't get counted at all. I'm not sure that my numbers are adding up there. I apologize for this. I wonder if I'm using the wrong slides, but okay. What kind of data can we use to try to get at this? So luckily for us, the survey of manufacturing does not count workers, so heads of staff workers, bodies if you want, but they do count expenditures. So we know how much dollar is spent on temporary staff and staff employees. This is something that gets asked every year since 2006, and the last day I have is December 31st, 2017. Of course, they also measure payroll, and payroll employment is sort of the more traditional thing. The challenge is going from expenses, which is what we measure, to my orange heads, because that's what I want to go put back in the employment measures. So I need bodies here, not dollars. That's going to be a big part of sort of what we do. We also know things about the staffing agencies because they are in the universe of firms. That's the longitudinal business database, which is essentially all of the private non-farm businesses in the United States and gives me information about location, age, and payroll employment, which, as you were pointing out, Ernesto, for the staffing agencies is sort of these workers that gets dispatched around. And this data set can also be enhanced with revenue data, which allows us to compute to some forms of productivity, for example. So this is going to what you were saying. How do we measure this? So there are two things. Expenditure on temp workers or expenditure on staffing is exactly this line of the ASM. Temporary staff and leased employee expenses, the total costs paid to specific intermediary, POs, professional employee organization, and staffing agencies. Notice that it's not this. Purchase professional and technical services. That would be what I called outsourcing a minute ago, which include consulting, accounting, bookkeeping, and so on and so forth. We could expand it. We just thought, for reasons that become clear in a moment, that this is the closest we can get to that one-to-one substitution. While with the outsourcing, it would be a bit of a different story. So then what do? It's actually relatively simple. We say, okay, why does this move? The expenditure on staffing, we measure. This is the dollar spent on staffed workers at establishment J at time T. What is that equal to? Well, it's however many workers you hire. This is AMP staffing at establishment J time T, by how much you pay them. That's the wage of staff workers at establishment J time T, and the markup that the agency charges to the client business. This is essentially where the profits come out of. We would like the employment, we have expenditures, we need to sort of find numbers for the other two things. It turns out that the American Staffing Association gives us some data on the markup. That's about 10 to 15%. It's relatively reasonable. That's a fairly competitive sector. And if anything, we know they are competing with in-house hiring. Like if these markups start becoming too high, then firms will be like, well, no, thank you. We'll hire our own people. So it makes sense. We also have an external validation using the profits of the staffing firms, which is what I'm describing over here. It gives us the same number.
May I ask you, do you think there is a fixed cost? Because there is sometimes you need to have a contract between the staffing company and the...
Yes. Excellent question.
I don't know if in Europe there has been, since the year 2012, something like this, there have been a big change in terms of which are your duties with these staffing workers. So now you need to be clear that all the insurance are paid, everything is paid. So there have been some changes there. But I think it's more like a fixed cost in terms you have to be monitoring that the staffing company is doing well or is paying everything to their workers, everything like this. So.
Yeah, so no, that's a great point. That's a great point. So there are very likely sort of relationship costs that you need to pay, very much like with a bank. So once that relationship is in order, then sort of that then you do get sort of these kind of optimization. This comes out sort of a first order condition almost. Now, the reason why we think this is fine is because it would be trouble for us if those fixed costs also entailed adjustment costs. So that changing your relationship with the staffing agency was problematic. We don't have any evidence of that. In fact, quite the contrary, which I'll show you in a second. So if it's a fixed cost that you pay once, it sort of comes at the top. It's a different problem. It's like a separable problem, and I'm okay. Regarding the services sort of that you're supposed to give to your workers, the US context is a little bit different, but there is good evidence that at least in the past, this kind of technology was used to avoid precisely those benefits. I could try augmenting the the wage, with some of those other measures of compensation. We do have a version that strips out benefits. Benefits are right now here. And I'll tell you in a second sort of how we think about it. So the way we think about it is that I'm going to take a gross overestimate of this W, because I know it's going on the denominator. So I'm going to divide by something too big. In fact, I'm going to divide by the payroll, the average payroll, the average wage for the payroll workers. I know that this is too much, precisely for the reason that Alejandro was mentioning, which is, if you think of benefits, we know that staff workers have less of that. And there is, in fact, work showing that even the baseline wage is lower to some extent. But that's fine because I'm putting something too big at the denominator, which means my estimates will be conservative, and I feel okay about that. And we have a similar argument for sort of these for the other bit, but in the interest of time, I'll sort of talk about it later. We're doing things to refine this process, take into account, for example, the skills, to have a bit of a skill composition in DSW, but what I'll show you today doesn't do that. So think of this as potentially a conservative estimate of how many sort of workers are in fact staffed. Okay, so now the name of the game in the last 20 minutes or so, I want to show you that this is a technology for flexibility. Firms use this when they need to change their size, when they're responding to shocks. And therefore, it is appropriate to think about job reallocation because that's the aggregate technology for change. When we need to sort of grow some, establish and grow some sectors, that's job reallocation. That's the function of the labor market. So first things first, staffing is large. The employment share of these type of firms, temp help firms, has grown by over 80% since the 90s. It's a booming sector. Every year, temp help firms lease out as many workers as the equivalent of 25% of aggregate hires. So 1 in 4 is actually sourced with this technology. And it just so happens that manufacturing is actually the sector with the highest use of temp workers. It's common in every sector, but manufacturing ends up being a very good place to look at it because there's many of them, and because the production is highly stylized. You know, if you're making widgets, these are the steps to make widgets. There isn't, I mean, there is some variation, but less than things like services. So this is the labor share of staffing firms since 1919. I can do this earlier than the 2006 I was mentioning you because this comes from the LBD. What I want you to notice is sort of these upward trends, but also a stair-step pattern if you want. Recession sort of bring it down. This is why many central banks, perhaps also Banco de Chile, uses staffing as a leading indicator. When you zoom in on manufacturing, you find that manufacturing is a high use of staffing. In our data, 8 in 10 establishment reports positive expenditure at least once since 2006, and about half of that, 4 in 10, report positive expenditure on staffing every single year. So this is a technology that firms use on a regular basis, and they use it more and more. The share of revenue that is spent on staffing has in fact increased over time. And this is exactly sort of an illustration of that in orange. I guess I inverted my colors. I should fix that. In orange, you see payroll employment. Essentially, that's the expense on that has been fairly constant in this period. But if you compare to that instead the share of expenses on staffing, you see that it sort of really grows, especially in the 2010s. This is actually across the board. There is virtually no role for composition, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in the question if you want, because I want to show you some other things. But you should think that it's not there is no differential sort of patterns of growth in staffing. Every single sort of firm is using more of it. And this has, as I said, an impact potentially on the way we think of manufacturing. It would sort of boost employment and lower productivity growth because you're putting a bigger denominator. It also has some impact on the labor share, which would be about 1 percentage point higher on average in a period in which it dropped by about 2 percentage points, a little over that. So this potentially is important. Notice I can't say too much about the secular decline because my data starts in 2006. But if we had better data or a different source, we could probably say a little bit more. Okay, so then first things first, let's try to sort of show you that this has an impact. And I'm going to do that correction that I mentioned at the beginning. The correction is essentially adding my estimate for the employment, for the staffing employment, according to that formula that uses that too big of a denominator and the estimate for the markup and the expenditure data. So this is my estimated sort of employment in staffing. I can compute that in the ISM every year, add it back and see what happens. So what happens is that I find that staff job flows are a large and increasing portion of total job flows. So this is a good chunk of the way the economy reallocates jobs across establishment. In particular, you can see that the yearly staffed job flow is about 15%. This is my 14.6% of the corresponding payroll job flows. And this portion has been increasing. If you look at the last row, you'll see that staff job reallocation is an increasing share of payroll job flows. So relative to the payroll, what we measured is has been growing, and on average is about 15% of it. This matters because the payroll one has been declining over time. So this is the labor dynamism sort of debate. So what I'm showing you here, this table is a little bit complicated, but let's go sort of step by step. So the three columns are job creation, job destruction, and their sum, job reallocation. Focus on the last measure, the job reallocation. The payroll job reallocation as a yearly job flow rate is about 15%. In a year, about 15% of jobs are reallocated across establishment. That's a healthy labor market. That's sort of what we want. We want jobs to move around to more productive firms. If you look, on the other hand, at the staffed job reallocation, the flow rate is much, much higher. This makes a lot of sense because we know that these jobs are shorter and they reallocate faster. That's the whole technology, in fact, a fast reallocation of workers. Instead of going through putting out an ad, screening the candidate, accepting application, then you select one, you make an offer, you bargain, so on and so forth. The only thing that my client business needs to do is pick up the phone and say, I need 2 welders. And the staffing agency sends a list. And the morning after, the welders are there. So it makes sense that this is a much higher number, but it's considerably higher. It's about 4 times higher. Oh no. So then when you sort of look at the total, you get a slightly higher number. But what's most important is that the staffed reallocation have been growing. So they reallocate faster and there's more of them over time, which is going to lead to sort of a smaller drop in dynamism. So this is the last panel, this job flow percentage change from 2016 to 2007. If you look simply at the payroll, you see that this has dropped by almost 14%. And then there's a huge firm dynamics literature saying this is bad. This means that the labor market over time gets worse and worse of reallocating workers. We are becoming more misallocated. We are becoming more stiff as a labor market. Natural policy response in many European countries before the backlash has been, we need to liberalize the labor market. We need to sort of make it easier to hire and fire. That's how we give dynamism to firms. What we want to point out is that, in fact, firms are already doing some of that through staffing. We just do not count it, and so we didn't know. But if you sort of correct, then the drop in dynamism is about 8%. There is some drop in job reallocation, but it is 37% lower. So in a way, the economy is becoming much less stiff than we thought, because a good chunk of that movement is going into these other buckets, the staffing bucket. Now, does that mean yay, no problem? Absolutely not. So there's a couple of issues with this. One is, as we pointed out before, we don't know about the productivity content of these reallocation. If I'm swapping excellent workers that I used to hire for mediocre workers that I get through the staffing agency, productivity might suffer. So now the new reallocation are not as good at doing this productivity growth. There's also the problem of workers. There's good evidence that staff workers have fewer protections, which again has triggered a policy response again. So this change is not just measurement, there's some economics behind it. So we make a dent in that by looking at why firms do it, but there's certainly more to be said, and perhaps more to be said, especially to decision makers and politicians, which I feel have been making these decisions on the basis of hearsay, union concern, or firm-like association concern, but without much information from economists.
Claudia?
I'm going to skip that and then go on. Yes.
Could you go back to the table, please?
Of course.
So trying to interpret this number through the computation you have to do to translate expenditure to bodies. So the 27% means that the expenditure in staff work in staff expenditure of firms on staff firms is been increasing more than the wages that those firms are paying to actual payroll workers. Is that correct?
Keeping fixed the markup, which we do keep fixed. And I think that's a correct interpretation. And we interpret that as, well, so the 27% means that over time, the ratio of those two things, modulo the markup, has been growing. And so I think that's correct. I can sort of show you.
The issue, I mean,
it's a difference between, sorry, so now I'm taking not the total job reallocation, but just the staff job reallocation. So sort of forget about this part. It's just this one. Can you see my highlighting? Not at all, right?
We do.
Okay, great. So this, no, this doesn't do it. So this bit and difference with this bit.
You see my point. There could be general economic forces, so that could be contaminating the numbers. If it's true that the demand for workers is being shifting from from payroll workers to staff workers, then the relative salaries of those workers would change.
Yes, no, you are completely right. So what you're saying is like this WP itself could be adjusting. I think there's good. So, and I would have to know something about the ratios of those two. I don't know that. What I can tell you is I tried to do something else, which is instead of taking WP, to make a composite wage index from occupation data. So let's make a silly example. There are two occupations in the world. I know that staffing is 80% occupation 1 and 20% occupation 2. Payroll is the opposite. And so if I know the wage of occupation 1 and 2, I could construct a wage staffing using 80% of the wage of 1 and 20% of the wage of 2 and vice versa. So we did that. And we found very similar results.
But are those compositions fixed through time, or it is evolving through time? Because here the question is about the time difference.
Yeah, so in our period, it's relatively fixed, but it's also true that occupation data is asked every 2 years. So there are, and within the occupation itself, you could have change potentially. So we are still abstracting from some of it. I think that's still potentially a problem. The other thing that we thought about doing, but I don't have it for you because census hasn't cleared it yet, is actually to do away entirely with this approximation and do dollar reallocation. That has its own issues because of course dollars can be conflating quality for quantity, but it also doesn't sort of require me to do these approximations. All of these exercises point in the same direction. The specific number is this 37%, 25%, 43%. That's what changes, but this never goes into the single digit. So yes, the 37%, we think of it is on one hand is a lower bound because of this denominator that we put that's a little too large. On the other, it's an upper bound because it's kind of giving it 1 for 1. The numbers will fluctuate, but I feel very confident saying this is between 25 and 45%. The specifics of how you do it will change the precise number, but this is not a 0. It's also not 100%. I don't know if that sort of satisfies.
Okay. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, we also did some versions in which we tried sort of to separate production workers from non-production workers. So we took the wages only of the production workers of a firm, which could be closer. Things don't change all that much. But I hear you that the time could potentially conflate some of this. Okay, so I have about 10 more minutes. I'm not going to talk about business cycle. Ask me later. Let me show you what is staffing anyway. And this is interesting, right? Because people, and you guys mentioned this exactly. If I were in Italy, I would know exactly why a firm uses staffing, because as soon as you hit sort of the 50 employees mark, a deluge of regulations come upon you. And because if you're trying to use a temporary worker that's still your employee, you would have to hire them after you use them twice. There's all sort of regulation. In France, the maximum duration is 1 day. So I would know exactly why you would be doing it. But then in the US, which is sort of famously known for not having any of those protections, why do firms do it? And why don't they do only that? So we try to understand this problem, and first we bring data to the issue. So what we want to show here is that staffing is a technology for change, and here goes the fixed cost that you were mentioning before. So we find a few different things that we think are suggestive that firms use staffing when they need to quickly adjust their size. And then, so we do first a descriptive exercise, which is what you're seeing here, and then we do an actual causal exercise with an IV design. So what we find is that the use of staffing is increasing in revenue growth. Firms which are growing faster tend to use staffing more. This is an extensive margin. However, the share of revenue that's spent on staff labor, how much, is U-shaped in revenue growth. It's especially high, so the intensive margin really kicks in for firms that are either shrinking fast or growing fast. Again, this makes sense. This is in fact very similar to what we see. It's the extreme version of what we see with payroll labor. If you're familiar with this literature, people talk about hockey sticks, where you see reallocation both in shrinking firms and in growing firms, but more in the growing than the shrinking. This is going to be a bit more balanced because this is a technology that's cheap to change. That's the very definition of it. It's cheap to hire and fire because you're not hiring and firing. You're changing a contract. You're adjusting how much you buy. You're not hiring and firing workers. We also find that the share of revenue that's spent on staff labor is higher in smaller and younger establishments. These tend to be higher growth establishments again, so that makes sense, even though larger and older and high-tech establishments are more likely to use staffing to begin with. This is the piece of evidence that I think is more suggestive of fixed costs. If you're larger, you tend to sort of pay this fixed cost, which is a smaller share of your own revenue. You access to this technology, and then you're sort of done. So this is showing that these other sort of like suggestive evidence. The green line is job creation. The reallocation that pertains to adding jobs to the economy. Job destruction is the opposite. Job destruction, these are the firms that are shrinking. The sum, as you can see, is up here. And you can see that on the x-axis, I have revenue growth decile. So a 9 is a firm that's growing very fast. A 0 is a firm that's shrinking very fast. And we tend to omit especially job creation for those that are fast. So we are missing job creation in the economy. So we think that these are evidence for this idea that this is a technology for changing size without paying the cost of changing size. And now we're going to try to test this idea directly. So let me see if I can be relatively fast. Am I doing? I think I'm doing okay with time, actually. So to do that, we would need to think about a shock that potentially affects labor demand, but not labor supply. And the first thing we do is sort of very, very simple. We set up a problem where regular labor, payroll labor, which is here denoted by LP, is subject to markdown. So there is a friction, you may call it monopsony, but essentially there's a wedge on the adjustment of that, which I'm going to call mu by nu. But staff labor is flexible. So the ratio of that is not subject to the monopsony markdown, which I denote by nu. And you could allow for adjustment cost here as well. It doesn't change all that much. So I just collapse everything into the nu, while mu is meant to capture distortion in the output market. So we allow, for example, for markups in the output market. That doesn't concern us in a way. So then if you use these kind of specification, which is just your regular first order condition from the cost minimization problem, then you do get that log changes in labor expenditures are proportional to changes in revenue. Ideally, you want something that changes revenue without changes labor supply, and you would be able to recover the reaction of different types of labor. So this brings me back to my example of the helicopter manufacturer. So Agusta is a big military provider, is a large firm internationally. And they had a command with the US government for military helicopter. And then 2 years ago, the war in the Ukraine breaks out, and the government suddenly shows up and says, actually, we need 2 more helicopters, and we need them in 3 months. Now, typically, that's not how the firm operates. These are sort of long-term procurement auctions. So you know in advance, like 5 years in advance, you're going to have to make 3 helicopters. So what at Agusta, the executives told us is that that's where staffing really comes into play. This is essentially a exogenous shock. Something happens, the government wants more helicopter. We can either say, no, sorry, we cannot do that. Or we can change our labor demand. We're going to do that through staffing because that's much faster. We want to approximate that idea. The way we do it is in 2 ways. We're going to look at 2 types of instruments. One looks at the real price changes of imported inputs. Almost all of the manufacturers in the US import inputs, intermediate inputs. You should think of metal, paper, any sort of intermediate inputs that firms may use. Chemicals, all sort of things. Many of these are imported, which means that their price fluctuates with the international price and is presumably entirely orthogonal to this specific plant labor supply. If something happens to the price of copper, it is unlikely that the labor supply in Dayton, Ohio is impacted. So that's my exogeneity. However, of course, if the price of your imported inputs, say, increases, that's going to change all of your other input demand, including labor demand, and presumably including staffing demand. What we want to show is that staffing responds more and more quickly to these changes. For a subset of our firms, which are just exporters, we can also do fluctuations in real exchange rates. Suppose that a firm is selling especially a disproportionate amount to Switzerland. Switzerland decides to devaluate the Swiss franc. That is a shock, essentially, to the demand of this firm. The same sort of idea apply. Revenue goes down, but this is unrelated to labor supply to that specific plant. And we can do that because we have a cool data set called Lifted, which is how you read this thing over here, which details transaction level data for the universe of import and export transaction for the US. So we construct these 2 things, and we now have an exogenous shifter of revenue. We can go study how this works. So here I'm showing you the OLS, which is sort of the naive regression based on first order condition, and the 2 IVs. And the thing I want you to notice is, since I don't have all that much time, is that the coefficient on payroll is smaller on impact than the one on staffing. So on the rows, these are different periods. We also have a hunch that if this is a permanent change, staffing won't respond in the future. That's exactly what we find, which makes sense. If my helicopter demand goes permanently up by 2, it's much more likely that Agusta adjusts permanently or in the long run their labor. We don't find too much of that, but also remember the nature of our shock is short-lived. These prices fluctuate very quickly. So in a way, I'm not surprised, but I expected that. What I do also expect
this data is at the industry.
This is at the transaction level. This is at the transaction firm level.
At firm level, and the shock and the IV is at the sector level, or is at the firm level?
We do both. It depends which share you're using, essentially. Like, say the price of copper changes, I can take the share of copper that's used by your industry or your own. We do the same. I think this one I'm showing you are actually with the industry, but they look very similar. So that's why I'm not super sure.
Claudia, for this table, can you control by occupation?
No, I can control by detailed industry. So we do that. We don't have occupation in this data. So you can see my control down here. These are all at the firm level. So there's just no occupation information
issue. There is a composition issue about this, right? So the payroll. So there's a selection of which type of occupations firms decide to keep in the payroll and which one they're doing the staffing.
All I'm saying is that following a change in the cost of your inputs, you decide to adjust staffing by a considerably larger margins than you do payroll. Whether this is driven by occupation or something else, I'm not sure I have much to say. But I am reassured by the fact that these two things move differently. Like you get a much larger response in staffing. If staffing is a way to be flexible, then this is the kind of evidence I want to see. Now you may tell me, well, staffing is flexible because it gives you a different occupation. We don't have evidence for that or against that in a way. It could be. By sort of anecdotal evidence, it looks like it's not necessarily the case. And it's not, I don't completely understand how sort of if the price of copper changes, you suddenly want more engineers and less welders. Maybe, but I don't have too much to say. Perhaps it's not super satisfactory, but that's what it is. Okay, let me show you the last thing. I think I'm out of time. Someone give me some sort of reassurance on that.
No, I think we have until 1:50, so we have time. Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry,
okay,
12:50. Yeah.
I know. I know what you meant.
13 more.
Okay, well, I don't have 13 probably, but we'll see. So then we do another thing, which is an exercise for those of you who are in the firm dynamics literature. This is the paper in the AER, Decker, Halting-Munger, and others that looks at the responsiveness of firms. So in this whole literature, dynamism matters because this is how we seize opportunities. We seize productive opportunity. We have firms grow. We react to negative shock by downsizing. So if firms are not able to do this sort of flexible gymnastics, our economy will be misallocated, misallocation very bad. They show essentially that the ability of firms or the reactions of firms to these changes in productivity, the things that will make you want to grow or shrink, have become more muted over time. And what we think is that, well, if the hypothesis that staffing is a technology for change and that staffing is more and more important, then we should see some of that reactivity transfer to staffing. So it's not anymore on payroll, but we should see it in this other type of labor that's more flexible. So we replicate exactly what they do, except now instead of having changes in employment, we have changes in employment of category C. And the category C can be either payroll, which is what they originally looked at and found at 0, or staffing. Then we have industry fixed effects, and then we have a change in productivity, which is going to be log differences in productivity, just like sort of what you think. And we use different measures of productivity. I think what we're showing you here is actually sales per worker. Doing more sophisticated things doesn't really change too much. Of course, you may ask, what do we do if, because employment Employment is sort of a continuous measure. You always have employees if you exist, but you don't always have staffed employees. So we have to do these adjustments here. So if the change is positive, you will take the DHS growth rate. But if you stop using staffing, we'll give you a 0 in this change of employment S. And this is just because staffing is much more discrete than regular employment.
Why don't you? Because you can have this is to understand whether how much is the fixed cost. Try to look whether how useful is that one firm has a staff worker or not over time. You can see that, no?
Yes, we can see that. And as I was telling you, 4 in 10 uses it every year. Another 2 in 10 never use staffing, and another 4 use it intermittently. So it's in and out, so to speak. Sometimes they use it, sometimes they don't.
Yeah, to see whether there is a fixed cost, you will see that you can see, for example, that larger firm can be more easy enter exiting that small firm if there is a fixed cost to use or not. So
I think the way I understand it from talking to firms and to clients, so staffing firms and their clients, is that the cost is to establish the relationship. This is a bit like the staffing agency gets to know you. The first time you do business together, they send you a list of welders and you send back, 6 out of 10, and you tell them, nah, these guys didn't really know how to work with this very specific laminated metal or whatever. The second time they do that, on the other hand, now they know that you're thinking of laminated metal and they send you the right people. Yeah. So there's a setup cost into setting up that relationship. Adjusting the number, however, is completely free. Like if you say, hey, this period I don't need any welders, they'll just wait. And then next period you need free, okay, fine. So once it's set up, it's sort of adjusting the numbers of welders is not hard. That's exactly what sort of we wrote in here. I don't have much more to say about the setup costs, other than we do see, in fact, larger firms having a stronger extensive margin response. We do see smaller firms have more intensive margins. Once you pay that fixed cost, you use it more if you're small. That also would be consistent with this sort of fixed cost idea. But yeah, so I don't have any direct evidence on that. It doesn't seem to be a monetary fixed cost. That's what I wanted to say. It's not like, oh, the first time you pay like a entrance in the club kind of fee. That doesn't seem to be the case. So let me sort of go towards conclusion. What do we see here? Now we're looking at the effect of productivity shocks over and above what would be your normal trend on how much you change different types of employment, either temporary in blue or payroll in orange, and in different horizons, either at the time of the shock, which happens between T-1 and T, 1 period after, 2 periods after. I don't know why this thing sort of moves by itself sometimes, sorry. And what do we see? Well, we see what we wanted to see, which is that staffing on impact moves much more than employment. In fact, we find a 0, just like those other guys had found. But the difference is that we allow for 2 different margins. And so because this one is the flexible margins, that's where you see the response. Predictably, this is much more muted in subsequent period. If the productivity shock is long-lived, you start seeing a little bit more response in payroll. Again, if there is a permanent shift in military spending, Augusta will just hire more worker. Now staffing is not all that helpful. So let me make a few comments before sort of, actually, let me tell you this and then make a few comments that might be interesting for discussion. So we also look at generalized volatility, either of firms or of industries, and we do 2 things. We compute a standard measure of volatility, which is exactly what you think it is, and it's sort of like down here. And then we compute what we call a positive bias volatility, which gives more weight to positive volatility, to shocks that increase my labor demand. This makes sense because staffing you cannot have negative staffing in a way. Like the best you can do is not hire anyone through staffing, but that's about it. So then we expect exactly what we thought we would find, which is the staffing revenue share is increasing in volatility, and more so if I think of the sort of positive bias volatility. Staffing is a way for firms to expand primarily. And that happens more often for firms who are very volatile. Okay, so before I do this, let me think out what would be the most interesting thing for you guys. Okay, so staffing can also is sort of it chimes with many other things that are happening in the labor market. One of them is the disappearance of short jobs. There are a few apologies, should be Smith, it's a typo, that show that jobs are becoming longer and longer, and there's been a strong decline in short jobs, in particular single quarter jobs. Just told you that the average duration of a staffing job is exactly about 12 weeks or 11 weeks, something like that. This is then very consistent with the staffing increase, because the assignment length, how much time sort of the staff workers spends at any of these manufacturers is 11 weeks, there it is. And the average firm tenure at the staffing agency is about 3 years. So these are consistent with that. And this is showing you some things about the tenure of staff workers, which is increasing relative to payroll workers. So more and more workers spend time into these staffing agencies. Their tenure at the agency is growing. And this is an attempt of going to some of the things you guys have mentioned, because now I'm using worker level data. I can, for example, put occupation fixed effects, education fixed effects, and more sort of covariates. And I can show that this increase in tenure actually holds when I keep composition constant. So the increase, these displacement of jobs, if you want, this substitution happens partially for composition that is believable. But even in sort of some of the exercise when I can control for that, these will be sort of changes within occupation, within education, within state, for example. Even then, we see that there is an increase in the tenure of staff workers, so that more workers in any occupation, any education being, are spending more time being staffed than being payrolled. That's the sense in which we have some evidence for substitution.
Yes, so at the CPS,
yes.
At the CPS, you have that the worker is a staff worker.
Yes, so this is exactly the CPS. It's one of their supplementary surveys, which do I have it here? So it's a part of the job tenure supplement. It's asked every 2 years, I think. So you can see here, yeah, there was an exception earlier on, but I think we didn't use it. So it's asked every 2 years. So it's not part of the regular CPS, it's one of the extra surveys. And I want to say it's like in May and February in some years. So it's called the contingent worker surveys, where they asked, are you staffed or contingent or leased? They say yes. There's a lot of evidence that this is an undercount, because a lot of people don't understand. Yeah. They're not working for, you know, the helicopter manufacturer, because they go to work there every morning, so they think that's their employer, but the employer record is not. So the levels are a bit off, but we think that the comparison, at least when it comes to sort of these occupational composition education, could be informative. And so even then, this is sort of our attempt at getting at that. Okay, so before I conclude, I'm going to put these up here, but I wanted sort of to give you a few pointers from sort of from my experience of talking to these firms. There's very little data on, as you have seen, directly on this. Can I actually stop and just talk to you guys with my face, maybe? Am I doing that now? Okay. So what I was trying to say is, I had the opportunities of talking to several client firms, to several staffing agencies, and also to employees of the staffing agencies. So I think what the most interesting part on the part of the worker is that there's a very large literature showing how these workers are somewhat, you know, sell short. They get lower wages, they get fewer benefits. There seems to be that these jobs are not really a step up. They're a road to nowhere. They're not very good for human capital accumulation. All good causes for concern. One of the things, however, that workers, when you talk to them, highlight as a plus to them, because you might ask, why would anyone want to be a staffed worker, is the flexibility. People would tell me over and over, this is the only type of employer that allows me to take the entire summer off when I have to take care of my kids, and then come back to that very same match. So I just mark myself unavailable for the summer months, and I can sort of go on, come back in September, they find an assignment for me. So that seems to be something on the worker side that is potentially interesting to explore. We just don't have great data on the worker side, as I was mentioning, but this seems like ripe for exploration. This is the counterpart of what's happening to firms. Firms like this because they can escape these adjustment costs, and that is beneficial for them. They can produce more helicopters. You might wonder, though, if there are no regulations, as there are very few in the US, why are firms still doing it? And so we asked this to firms, and the number one mentioned that they highlighted two things. One we have in our paper to some extent, one we don't. The first thing that they said is, oh, no. And the cost of firing someone is not that I have to pay them, say, a severance pay like in many other countries. It's that all my other workers freak out because I just fired Johnny, their friend. Now, instead of firing, I just say, oh, no, we stopped our contract with Manpower. We're not working with Manpower anymore. And that feels much more palatable. That feels much less involved. So it's a morale cost, if you want, which is actually something a lot of Altieri's had. And then the other thing that they mentioned, which is not in our paper right now, but it's something we're looking forward to exploring, is a potential screening device, the trying out of workers. This is also sort of makes a lot of sense if you think about it. 1 in 6 of the temporary workers become becomes a payroll worker. So there seems to be a sense in which this could be entry jobs, at least in that sense. So these are the things that I wanted to mention for which I don't have very hard evidence, but they give context to how this technology works. And I think I'm just going to conclude with that. I can sort of show you my conclusion slides. Can I? I think so. See, I've become adept at WebEx. So what do we do in this paper? I like to think that we put staffing on the map for macroeconomists. Micro folks have been thinking about it quite a lot. Unions think about it quite a lot. We want to say this is something that firms do across the board. They do it very often. They do it to respond to shocks of various nature. So that gives them flexibility. And if you do sort of aggregate computations in manufacturing, you can see that this accounts for about 37% of the drop in dynamism. So it also has aggregate consequences. There is obviously more to be done. And I'm looking forward to some of the suggestions. Many already came up. So thank you so much. And I'll be happy to stay around for a few more minutes.
Thank you, Claudia.
Gracias, Claudia.
Yeah.
So, any other question?
Yeah. How do you know that these workers are workers that are doing the same jobs, or in Chile we have the data for that. In fact, there are a couple of papers on that. That we have these temporary agency workers, and we see whether they are in the production line or whether they are in the staff or more administrative staff.
Yeah, so essentially I don't. My best attempt at getting at that is not using the outsourced services. So I'm not using any consultant, I'm not using any, say, accountants, I'm not using cleaning, maintenance, repair. I'm only using these very specific sort of staffed and leased labor. There's reasons why I like that and why I don't. The reason why I like it is that it's more comparable, sorry. And the reason why I don't is that potentially these other sort of types of workers may also be part of the picture. I'm just excluding them because I can do better. What I would really like to have is the connection between the staffing agency and the client business, which I do not have. I cannot see sort of workers moving. I don't see the assignments, essentially. And that is a sort of a fundamental flaw of the way at least the US data is measured. I think the only place where I've seen that data is Austria, or if you go, but Argentina only has that for a specific firm, right? I thought. Like
no,
they got in touch.
They are able to match the employee who is in a user firms, and they know also the staffing firms also, so they can follow.
So they do see the assignment. Okay, that would be super interesting. The only paper I've seen with Argentine data is this Drenick et al. And they were also looking at outsourcing, kind of sort of conflating the two things.
Yeah, that's true. They're doing both at the same time.
There's reason to do that. And for us, the reason why we didn't want to do that is if you think about a firm, right, they're trying to get organized and they're thinking, should we have maintenance as our own employees or should we contract it out? That seems to me sort of a boundary of the firm kind of question.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily relevant for the reallocation because you do it once. Once you decide that the maintenance is going to be clean your office incorporated, that brings it to you. Then that is sort of a one shot. Now it's outsourced, end of story. While what we see is this sort of continuous in and out, this response to shocks. And so we limited ourselves to staffing for that reason.
Yeah.
I think the importance could be even larger if you did all of these other things. Another one that we are missing entirely is the consultant. The people who come and do some consulting, I'm sure like you have it at Banco de Chile as well. And then it's a one shot kind of thing. I mean, that's also could have been an employee once, but we just don't have very good data to measure any of those.
Why don't you use the CPS wages for staffing workers and not? Because there you can have the
Yeah. So that's what we did with the sort of occupational wages I was telling you. The problem is that the wages are measured only twice a year in the CPS, and it never, only a fraction coincides with the job tenure supplement.
Okay.
So we have a very small sample. We feel a little more confident for the occupation because we can use the censuses. So we're sort of doing this mashup of OEWS data, the occupational employment and wages statistics, to impute a wage, but the occupation comes from the CPS. So you tell me you're a welder. Maybe I didn't ask you in that month for the wage, but I know for the OES, what is the wage of a welder in that specific city? And I'm gonna mesh it up and sort of do all of these for all occupations, put it in the denominator. Has other issues, obviously, because these are not administrative data. It's sort of self-reported. Do people really know what their wage is, whatever? But so that's something that we have done towards that direction. I should show it. I just don't have those disclosed, and so because even if you only change the denominator, the top is using census data, so you have to redisclose the whole thing. But it's similar essentially. Okay, well, thank you so much for all the comments. I'll be around in the afternoon. Agustin, you'll have to tell me exactly. I'll just log in into that link that you gave me, and I
let you know. So thank you everyone for coming. So see you next week in the Central Bank webinar series.
Bye bye.
Bye bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks for coming.